In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains why we get disgusted by certain sexual behaviors.
So disgust is considered to be one of the basic human emotions, defined by a strong revulsion and desire to withdraw from an eliciting stimulus or event. Physically, disgust is accompanied by a distinct facial expression involving constriction of the oral and nasal cavities. So it's something like that, to close yourself off. Evolutionary models of people will make that face when they hear a dirty joke that they're really quite offended by. Evolutionary models of disgust propose that this emotion evolved to help us avoid contaminated or harmful foods or other potential sources of disease, such as sexual contact. Now that's interesting, because there's also an idea that floats around the general culture, and I think it's been more elaborated upon, partly since the time of Freud, but particularly since the 60s, that sexual disgust is culturally produced. It's like, you can just drop that idea. It's not the case at all, any more than disgust related to food is culturally produced. Culture moves it, but the disgust response to sexual contact and to food is extremely powerful innately, and you know that, because otherwise everyone would always be sleeping with everyone else. Like there has to, because obviously sexual contact is a primary motivator. Well, something has to regulate it. And you might say, well, good sense is what should regulate. It's like, yeah, right, man, good sense doesn't regulate anything. And so there's no way that's going to happen, is the regulator for sexual behavior. And that's grounded in contempt and disgust, and we saw a lot of that in the parts of the Crumb video that we watched, because the Crumb brothers were always being the targets of contempt and disgust. So that's pretty rough. But you got to think about why that is too. It's sexually transmitted diseases are no joke. And we don't know how long human beings have been plagued by them, but you can presume that it's pretty much since the beginning of time. Syphilis was imported from the New World to the Old World, and it was very, very hard on Europe. It was one of the reasons that the Victorians were so strict in their sexual behavior, because syphilis was a nasty disease until we've, more or less finally brought it under control. It's quite susceptible to antibiotics. And it was, transmissible to infants, which is also a major catastrophe. And then, of course, AIDS, which was, the primary vector for the spread of AIDS was promiscuity. And the virus evolved to capitalize on promiscuity, because it does that. And, that could have easily wiped us out, wiped out tens of millions of people. And so, we're pretty smart and got it under control pretty fast. But, in some ways, it could have easily been otherwise. And also, AIDS turned out to be not that easy to catch. You actually had to engage in sexual contact. And generally, you had to engage in sexual contact of a relatively non-standard type, because the most typically used tissues are more robust to the probability of infection. So we have any number there's any number of reasons for people to be disgusted by sexual contact. So, and that's something that has to be contended with. In addition to its role in directly helping to expel harmful foods from the body, disgust also forms an important component of the behavioral immune system. The suite of psychological mechanisms that aid in the detection and avoidance of potential contaminants before they can make contact with the body. So, there's the immune system, right? It attacks invading pathogens, but there's an analog in your behavior, which is that you're unlikely to approach, touch, and consume anything that happens to be disgusting. And it's a weird system. So, for example, people are unlikely to want to touch a sterilized cockroach. And I don't mean one that's unable to breathe. I mean one that's been heated so that it's free of contaminants. People don't like to do that. They won't eat, and this will hardly come as any surprise, high-quality chocolate molded to resemble dog feces. Okay, so, and everyone laughs about that, right? Which is kind of an interesting response. Like, of course, no one would do that. Well, right, exactly. Although you cannot attribute that to logic, you can just attribute to the fact that that if you were in that situation, how you would feel. And the first thing you would feel is certainly not hungry, and then turned off, which is an interesting way of thinking about it, because turned off is essentially a sexual expression. Turned off. And then I think you'd feel like a moron, so to speak, if you ate it, right? To yourself and to anybody who also happened to be around. There would be something about self-contamination, voluntary self-contamination there that would make you appear really not very admirable or honorable. It's something like that. So